So in this video we are going to be building this drop-down menu with pure CSS. So there's absolutely no JavaScript involved here at all. Let's take a look at how this works. So we're going to be styling this up, but the difference is that this is an actual interactive menu. It drops down, you can have just text here or you can have links. Here you can see we've just got a sort of sub-navigation system with a few more links down here, and we can click anywhere on the page just to dismiss the navigation. So it works exactly like you would see in a JavaScript solution, probably not as powerful, but if you're looking for a menu system that uses no JavaScript, let's go ahead and build it. So to start off then we've got a empty document pretty much. There's a couple of things that I've done just to set this up. We're linking in this global.css style sheet here, and I'm also pulling in the Open Sans font from the Google Fonts API. So if you do want to do that, you can head over to google.com/fonts, pull this font in as I've done, and you'll have a nice font to work with on this page. So the style sheet that we're going to be using, as mentioned, that's already linked in up here. Currently completely empty, but we'll obviously fill this up, nice styles just to get everything working. So we have an empty page. Let's work first of all perhaps on the markup, just so we know how this is structured. Then we'll start to style it, and then we'll add the CSS functionality. The CSS functionality part of this is probably the most straightforward part. The hard part is styling it up. So let's create a nav element, and we'll go ahead and give this a class of nav main just so we can target that nice and easily. Now I'm going to be including a logo in here, so I'm going to have a div with a class of logo, and within that is just going to be text. Obviously on your site you can have an image or whatever you're using. So the actual navigation is going to be built up of from an unordered list. So an unordered list obviously is just a list of elements. Within that we have list items. So within here we're going to do something a little bit different. Normally within an unordered list and list items you would just have some kind of text in here or maybe a link or something. We are going to have a radio input type, which might seem a little bit strange at first. We're also going to have a label, which is going to be what we're actually styling up, so there's no anchor here. And we're obviously going to then have the content that scrolls down when you click it. So let's build up one of these first of all, then we'll duplicate it down and put some different content in. And once we've got all our markup done, we can start to style it up. So at the moment, if I just type some text in here, it doesn't look great, just looks like a item here and then an unordered list. So as mentioned, we're going to have an input type of radio. So an input with a type attribute set to radio. The name here is quite important because we need to group these elements together so they're all part of one set of elements that we want to click, and that will become a little bit clearer a bit later on. So I'm going to give this an ID, and I'm also going to give this a class. This is what we're going to target with CSS. So this is going to be, say, nav option. So now that we've got that, we just have a radio button. So that's pretty straightforward. But we need somewhere that we're going to click. And I guess I'll just talk a little bit about why we're doing this. The reason we're doing this is because CSS pseudo selectors allow us to target elements like form elements that have been checked or selected or whatever. So that's gonna be the sort of driving force between how we know this item has been clicked. Then we can show an element which is going to be that subnav. So let's create a label here. The label is for a particular ID. That's why this ID is important. These two here need to match. And we're going to have a class on this as well, and that's going to be called nav item. And inside of here is going to be the label you actually want to see on your menu. So I'm going to call that amazing. Now let's just duplicate this list item. We'll talk about the actual content a bit later. So we're going to say, well, we'll just call this CSS. Remember to change the for and the ID up here as well, so CSS as well. And then here we'll just say drop down or something like that. And remember, we need to change this, and we need to change the ID. So these are all unique. These inputs are unique. And the reason we grouped them with this nav group is because we don't want one or more to be selected at the same time. So these are now alternate. We can't select two. So we need to have a look at styling this up so it looks a little bit nicer at the top of our page. Then we'll start to introduce the actual nav content, see how that's styled, and that's what we're going to be hiding and showing. We're going to add some CSS transitions to that as well. So just underneath the nav, I want to add some content just to see how this reacts on the page with content. That's always really important. So I'm going to generate, say, 3 paragraphs with some lorem ipsum text in. This can be anything you want though. So our final result is this. So we can start to actually style this up now. So let's head over to our style sheet, which remember we have linked in, and let's apply some sort of base styles to the body and HTML elements. And that's pretty much going to be just getting rid of our margin, and it's going to be setting our font. So that's 1M. We're going to choose Open Sans because that's the font we pulled in with Google Fonts API, and we have a sans serif fallback there. So the content, which we've just created, is going to have a padding of 30 pixels. So at the moment then we see the following. So it looks a little bit nicer already. We've got this nice padding down here. Obviously, this is not an ideal way to include content on your page and wrap it. You might be using a grid system or something like that. So in terms of the actual nav main then, let's style this up. We're going to have a width of 100%. And we're going to choose a background color just to distinguish it for the rest of the page. So we'll say something like 222. And we'll give this a fixed height of, say, 70 pixels. And we'll set the color of this, any text inside of it. We'll need to make some adjustments for like anchors and stuff, but we'll set the color to white. So this now looks like this. So it's starting to look a little bit better. We just need to reposition these, get rid of these bullet points, and obviously hide the radio buttons as well. So let's style the logo up then. I'll just put this above. So nav main logo. And we're going to float that left so it sits to the left of our unordered list. We're going to give this a specific height of 40 pixels. And the padding here is quite important because we need to match this up with the padding of each of our items so it sits in place. So we're going to say 30 pixels on the top and the bottom, 15 pixels on the top and the bottom, and 30 pixels on the left and the right. And we're going to choose a slightly larger font size considering that this is our logo. And we're going to give this a line height as well of 40 pixels. You'll see why this is in a moment. So now that's pretty much nicely lined up. We have got a little bit of a gap here, but this is basically due to our unordered list. If we inspect this element here, you can see that this by default gives us some margin and padding, and we want to get rid of this. So we'll do that in a bit. So the nav main unordered list. Now doing this is a little bit dangerous because this means any unordered list within nav main, we want to say a direct descendant of this. We don't want to say any sort of child elements, ULs or anything like that. So I'm going to set the margin to 0, and I'm also going to set the padding to 0. That just gets rid of that nasty padding there that made that sort of pull down. And we want to say float left. And we also want to change the list style type. That's just going to get rid of the default borders and the default bullets. And we're going to set that to none. So we have the following. So already starting to look a little bit better. So now we're going to move on to each of the list items. So we're going to say each list item within that unordered list, we want to float that left because we want these to sit next to each other, not underneath like that. So now you can see they're nicely floating left. So for each of the nav items, we want to apply a few styles. So nav item. However, before we do that, we want to get rid of this nav option. So remember, the nav option is the actual input itself. We don't want to see this, and we've given that a class of nav option. You obviously don't need to give this a class name, but I guess it helps for just readability. So we're going to say display none. That's going to get rid of them. So we now have got these nice clean pieces of text to start working with, and that's our nav items. So we're going to display these as an inline block, and we're going to set the same padding on these as we set for our logo up here. So, oh no, slightly less because we don't want this to sit sort of too height. Well, the 15 pixels is the same because it's the top and the bottom, that's important, but the left and the right, we want this slightly reduced. And we're going to give these a fixed height of 40 pixels. And we're going to give these a same line height again as we did for our logo. And we're going to set the margin on these to 0. So that's going to give us the following. So they're just spread out nicely. They're in line with this logo, and they are starting to look like actual navigation items. So what we want to do then is just create a hover effect on these. So we're going to say nav item, and now pseudo selector is hover. We're going to change the background color when we hover over these. So we'll just say 444, just a lighter gray. And we're going to change the cursor to a pointer, because remember, these aren't anchors, they're labels. So we want this little cursor to change when we hover over them. So we've now got this nice hover effect, but when we click on these, we want the nav content to drop down. But what we're going to do is we're going to write the markup for the nav content. We're going to style it so we know it looks nice in the place that we want it. And then we can obviously position it where we want, hide it, something like that, and then only bring it down when we click. So let's down here style up our nav content. Remember, this doesn't exist yet. We need to actually write the markup for this, but it's not too difficult. So within our list item after our label, we'll create a div called nav content, and within here is just going to sit our contents. This can be anything, but what I'm going to do is include another div called nav sub. That's going to have an unordered list with some list items. So we could say something like, well, we can use anchors here. We can say something like more about us. Let's just give that a hash. And we'll duplicate this down a couple of times. Just say, do you care what is here? And we'll say something like, of course you do. Just something silly. So for this one here, let's just duplicate this actually, just to save a little bit of time. So that for the CSS menu item, let's just say, get rid of all of these, this unordered list here, and we'll just create an anchor, and we'll say something like learn more. And then for the last one, we'll maybe include the same as we did before. We'll just duplicate that content. So at the moment, this is going to look a little bit messy, but you can already start to see that these have been positioned where we need them. We will need to make a few adjustments. Obviously, at the moment, these unordered lists here still have the default margin on the left, or the padding on the left. I think it's margin, yeah, margin on the left. So what we need to do then is just basically start to style these up so they look a little bit nicer. So back over to global.css. For the nav content, we want these to be a position of absolute. We also want these to sit 70 pixels from the top, because remember, that's the heights that we gave our navigation. So we want to make sure these sit flush underneath the top. We're going to give these a max height of 0. What I'll do is I'll leave this property out just for now, because that's what's going to make this disappear. We also want an overflow of hidden, a background color, and we're going to match that to background color of the navigation, and we're going to set a color of white. And what we also might want to do is add a Z index, just so this is shown in the right order. So as you can see, it's already starting to look a little bit better. We have these that look a little bit more like drop downs here. You can't see the CSS one, it's probably hidden behind these, but let's carry on and start to style these. So I'm going to say any anchor within nav content is going to be white, and I'm going to get rid of the text decoration. So I'm going to set that to none. So now what we want to do then is have a hover for these as well. I mean, this is very basic stuff that you probably can make up for yourself. It's entirely up to you, but we're going to have an underline when we hover over these. And what we're also going to do is style up this nav sub here, this div element here. And we're going to set the padding on this. So nav sub. Now you might be thinking, why can't we just include inside of this nav content what we need. And the reason for that is when we do a transition, it's going to make it a little bit harder if we don't have a containing element, because things will start to look a bit funny. After you finish the video, you can go back and change this and see how it looks if you do remove this. There probably are other solutions, but just for the sake of an extra div, it doesn't really matter too much. And all I'm doing on this nav sub is setting a padding of 20 pixels. So that just gives us a little bit more padding around there. So obviously the unordered lists within here, we need to make a little change to these. So we're going to say nav sub unordered list, and we're going to do pretty much what we did before. We're going to get rid of the padding, we're going to get rid of the margin, and we're going to change the list style type to none. So that's just going to make that like so more like a little menu. And what we're also going to do then is for the anchors within the nav sub unordered list, we're going to set these to a display of inline block so we can apply some padding. Otherwise we're not going to be able to add padding. And all I'm doing here is adding padding on the top and bottom and nothing on the left and the right. So that gives us a little bit more space. So we can see each of these drop downs here. We've got the drop downs, they look like drop downs, but they obviously need to be hidden until we want to show them. And that's where under nav content, the max height of 0 comes in. If you set a max height of 0 on an element, it's obviously not going to show. It's still there, but it's not being shown. And what we're going to do is when we do a transition, when we actually show these elements, we're going to set the height to something like 400 pixels as the max height, and then we can add a transition on that max height property. That's going to give us the nice transition of it coming down. So now we want to look into the actual functionality of this. So when we actually click on an item up here, remember all we're doing is we're checking an option. So we're selecting an option, and that's going to give us the ability to style something next to that item, which is our nav content. And we can do that with CSS, and that's how we achieve this effect. So at the bottom here, we're going to say nav option. And remember, our nav option is the class we gave to this input. So when a nav option is checked, we're going to use the tilde here, and that just basically means any element along this sort of line of elements. So it doesn't go into different elements. It's not within this element. We're not styling something within an input because an input is doesn't have a closing tag. So it's something along this line, and then we can choose the class name here. So this is going to be nav content. So we say nav content. So it's once this nav option is checked, or a nav option that is checked, along the line, same line of elements, this nav content element we can start to style. So I can say max height 400 pixels. So that's pretty straightforward, but what that does is it actually gives us the functionality that we need. And because we're using radio buttons, the only element that's being checked is the one that we've currently clicked on, because clicking on one will uncheck any other radio element. So we're not quite done. There's a couple of things that we want to do here, because what we're not doing is saving the hover state. When I hover away now, it looks a bit strange. We've got this drop down, but the active state of this hasn't remained. So that's pretty straightforward. All we want to do here is say nav option again, and when that nav option is checked, the element next to this, which is the label, we just want to set the background color to the same background color as when we hover, which is 444. So now when I click this, wherever I move my mouse, this one has remained in some kind of active state. So we might think we're done. We've done all this. But what if a user wants to dismiss a drop-down? If I click anywhere else on the page, it's not going to dismiss it. And the reason for that is clicking anywhere else on a page doesn't uncheck a option. So what we need to do then is we need to find a way where we can click anywhere on this page and uncheck an option. And as far as I've worked on this, the only way I can think is to include another radio field. But the label for this radio field is going to span the entire width and the entire height of our content area. So when we click on that, it's not going to be part of this menu set, so it's going to check that item, and therefore none of these are going to be checked, and the drop downs will close. But first of all, let's just quickly look at the transitions, just so we can get the nice smooth transition when we click out the way. So when we actually do set the max height to 400 pixels, we also want to define that we want a transition on this. So the transition property allows us to define the property that we want to transition on, the time that the transition is going to take, and then the type of transition. So in this case, we want to transition on max height. I want this to say be 0.4 seconds. You can also use milliseconds, so you could say 400 milliseconds. It's entirely up to you. And we want to choose ease in. There are others like linear, ease in out, but we'll stick with ease in for now. I'm going to duplicate this a couple of times because these do require, at the time of recording, vendor prefixes. So these are just for different browsers implementations. So I'm doing WebKit for WebKit browsers like Safari and Chrome, and Moz for like Firefox. So now what we're going to see is when we click on these, they nicely just drop down. So we've got a nice animation on there, all done with CSS. So now what we want to do then is tackle this problem of how to dismiss these drop downs. And this is very messy. Obviously, there are probably other ways to do this, but the way I've done it is just adding a few additional labels and one option, another radio button. Now, really, if you think about it, the sort of markup, the extra markup you're adding might be worth the fact that you're not using JavaScript here if you don't need to, but I'll let you decide that. But we'll go ahead and implement this anyway, and we'll see what you think. So we're going to create an option, another radio, sorry. And I'm going to create this outside of the navigation. So this is going to be an input of a type of radio. So we're going to give this the same name, nav group. We're going to give this a ID like nav close, so we can target it with the label that we want to target it with. And we're going to give this a class of nav close option, just purely so we can hide that with CSS. We don't want this visible. Now let's just create a label up here, just so we can see how this works. So the label is going to be for nav close, and the class of this is going to be nav close, so we can style that up as well. But let's take a look at how this actually works. Remember, because this radio button is under the same group as these options, when I click on one to show it, as soon as I check this one will become unchecked. So you can see that that will just disappear. So the challenge now is having this, or the label for this rather, in a place where when a user clicks it, it will activate this option or this radio button, and then therefore these drop downs will go. Now there is one way of doing this, and that's to keep this like this and style it up as it is. Let's take a look at that solution, and then we'll see what problems we face with that. This isn't going to be a very good solution. So we're going to say nav close. This is the label, remember. We want this to be a position of absolute. We want this to be top 70 pixels, so it comes just below the menu. And we want the height of this to be 100%, and we want the width of this to be 100%. And we'll also say left 0 as well. So now when I just come down here and look at this label here, you can now see it fills up the entire width and height of the page. And that means that wherever we click on the page here, that drop down is dismissed. So it's just dismissing that, and you can see that radio being checked there. So let's get rid of that radio, nav close option, and let's just do a display none on that. So we now have what looks like a really good working solution, but there is a problem, and let's check out what that problem is. So let's say somewhere in my paragraph I have an anchor. So I'm going to say click me, and we'll just set the href to a hash. So everything's working nicely. But what happens when I want to click this link? You may have noticed that when I'm hovering, I don't get the default cursor, and that's because when I click it, well, nothing's happening. This label is now covering all of our content, which is stopping interaction on the page. Now, there are a couple of, there is a solution to this, but it more just causes additional problems. If we set the pointer events property to none, that now means we can click through. So it almost seems like we've solved the problem. But that means that when I have the drop down here and I click, it's not doing anything because it's not recognizing pointer events on that element. We're clicking through that element. So we can't really do that. So one solution is to show this label only when a drop down is clicked. And unfortunately, we can't target this label element from within here because we can't do things like parent selection in CSS. If we could maybe select all the way up to the body, and then this element within it we could then show. So what we need to do is grab this label, and this is not clean, but again, it's entirely up to you of the sort of benefit you think you're going to get from this over JavaScript. And I'm going to paste 3 of these onto each of my navigation items, just under the label for the actual drop down. So let's paste it here, just under that label there, and let's paste it here, just under that label. So what benefit are we getting from this? Well, what we're actually doing is, if we just inspect this, we now have this nav close element on our page looking normal, because remember, we've started with absolute positioning. We've given it a left property and height of 100% and width of 100%. We have the same one here as well for CSS, and we have the same one for the last element here as well. But we're still not seeing a solution because I still can't click this element. These elements still exist. So what we actually need to do is we need to hide these, like so, with the display none. So now I can click my drop down. I can't dismiss it because remember that element is now hidden, but I can click the content on the page. But we already know we can use a CSS selector once this option is clicked to show an element along the same level. And that element is that new nav close element. So all we need to do is say nav option checked along that level of elements, nav close, and we're going to display block on that. So now what's going to happen is, only when I check this, if we just check it out, you can see nav close at the moment isn't showing anywhere on the page. We can click through to the links that we want to click through. But when I click on one of these, and let's just inspect this, this nav close now is available. So I've clicked this element, I can click it away, and then I can click the rest of the content on my page. Same with this one. I can click dismiss and then click content on the page. The only downside to this is if I do open one of these elements here, these navigation elements, I can't click on this element here. But we can easily just dismiss it and go ahead and click with the rest of the content. So the solution's not perfect, but you can see how we can actually start to build more dynamic things with CSS using a couple of tricks, a little bit of extra markup, but it really is just a little bit of fun. And if you did want to implement this on a site, you can do today.